It's 2:14 in the afternoon, and the horizon suddenly disappears. The sky ahead of you is turning brown. The wind that was almost still a few minutes ago begins pushing dust across the ground faster and faster. You taste grit before you understand what's happening. Then the light changes. The landscape you knew a few minutes ago starts disappearing behind a moving wall of dust and sand. The path is gone, the distant hills are gone, and within minutes, you may not even be able to see the person standing a few steps away from you. Today, you would call it a sandstorm. For someone traveling through a desert thousands of years ago, it could become a fight against disorientation, exposure, thirst, and the terrifying possibility of becoming separated from the people who knew the way home. There was no weather app warning you to stay indoors, no satellite image showing the storm moving toward you, no vehicle coming to find you if you became lost. If you were already traveling when the storm arrived, you had to rely on what you had prepared, what you knew, and who was beside you. So how did ancient humans survive sandstorms that could erase the world around them? The answer wasn't that their bodies were somehow tougher than ours. It was that desert life forced people to turn preparation, navigation, clothing, shelter, and cooperation into a survival system. And that system began long before the storm appeared. Long-distance travel through deserts was never something people could approach casually. For communities living in arid environments, timing mattered. Traveling during the cooler parts of the day could reduce exposure to extreme heat. Routes were planned around known water sources, settlements, wells, oases, and recognizable landmarks. A journey wasn't simply a matter of deciding where you wanted to go, you had to know where water was, how far away it was, how long the journey could take, and what would happen if conditions changed. Because in a desert, a wrong decision doesn't just cost you time, it can cost you water, and water is the one resource you cannot negotiate with. This is the part modern retellings often skip. The survival advantage wasn't created when the storm arrived. It was created hours, days, and sometimes generations before it. People who repeatedly traveled through the same landscape accumulated knowledge about routes, terrain, seasons, and water. And that knowledge could be passed from one generation to another. The desert became a landscape that had to be remembered. A ridge, a rocky outcrop, a valley, a well, a particular route between two water sources, a place where travelers could stop. To someone unfamiliar with the landscape, these might look like ordinary pieces of desert. To an experienced traveler, they were navigation points. And that became critical when visibility disappeared. Because a sandstorm doesn't have to literally bury you alive to become deadly. It can simply take away your ability to know where you are. Imagine walking across a landscape you know well. You can see the hills, you can see the path, you know the direction you're traveling. Then the wind rises, dust begins filling the air, the horizon disappears, the landmarks disappear, the sun becomes difficult or impossible to see, the tracks beneath your feet begin disappearing. Suddenly, the same landscape you knew perfectly becomes almost impossible to read. And this creates a dangerous psychological trap. You still feel like you should keep moving, but without reliable landmarks, movement can take you farther from safety instead of closer to it. The safest decision may be to stop. Find whatever shelter is available. Stay with the group. Protect your face and eyes. Wait for visibility to improve. That sounds simple now. But imagine making that decision when everything around you is moving and you have no idea how long the storm will last. That is where preparation becomes more important than strength. And clothing was part of that preparation. Across historically documented desert societies, clothing evolved to deal with more than heat. Loose, covering garments could protect the body from intense sunlight, while also reducing direct exposure to blowing dust and sand. Head coverings could shield parts of the face and neck. A cloth pulled across the lower face could reduce direct exposure to airborne dust, although it was never a perfect filter and certainly couldn't make a severe storm harmless. This distinction matters. Ancient desert clothing wasn't some kind of anti-sandstorm technology. It was a simple way of reducing exposure. And survival often works exactly like that, not eliminating danger, reducing it. Cover more skin, protect the eyes, cover the nose and mouth as much as practical, reduce exposure, protect your water, conserve energy, stay close to the people who know the route. Small advantages begin adding together. And then there was the landscape itself. Experienced travelers knew that deserts were not completely flat, identical fields of sand, rocky terrain, ridges, depressions, walls, buildings, tents, and other structures could provide varying degrees of shelter from wind and blowing particles. The important thing wasn't finding some magical place where the storm couldn't reach you. It was reducing exposure. Even a familiar piece of terrain could become valuable when visibility collapsed. And this knowledge had to exist before the storm. You couldn't begin learning the desert while standing inside a wall of dust. You had to know where useful shelter might be before you needed it. That is why environmental knowledge was itself a form of survival technology. But there was another problem. What happens when you aren't alone? What happens when there are 10 people traveling with you, or 20, or an entire caravan? When visibility collapses, the group itself becomes one of the most important things you have left. Because every person may carry different knowledge. One person may know the route, another may know where the next water source lies, another may recognize a landmark, another may be responsible for animals or supplies. The group isn't just a collection of bodies, it is a collection of information. And losing one person can mean losing a piece of that information. This is why staying together mattered, not because ancient people had some romantic idea about never separating. Because separation could turn a difficult situation into a much more dangerous one. If you lose sight of the people who know the route, you lose more than companionship. You may lose your best chance of finding the way back. And then the storm arrives. The wind becomes louder. Dust begins striking exposed skin. The sky turns brown. Your eyes start watering. You pull the cloth tighter around your face. You can no longer see the landscape clearly. The person in front of you becomes a silhouette. Then even that silhouette disappears. For a moment, everything is reduced to sound. Wind, breathing, the movement of sand. Your own heartbeat. This is where panic becomes dangerous. Your brain wants to do something. Move, run, find the road, find the camp, find the people who disappeared a few seconds ago. But moving blindly can make the situation worse. So the survival response becomes almost the opposite. Slow down. Stay together. Get into whatever protection the terrain or equipment provides. Protect your eyes and airway from blowing particles as much as possible. Hold on to the people or supplies you cannot afford to lose, and wait for conditions to improve enough to navigate again. The goal isn't to defeat the storm. It's to get through the period when the environment becomes impossible to read. Because the storm itself is only part of the problem. The real danger may come afterward. The wind finally weakens. The dust begins settling. Light returns. You look around, but the desert doesn't look exactly the way you remember it. Tracks may be gone. Small landmarks may be partly covered. Loose sand may have shifted. A route that was obvious earlier may now be harder to recognize. And before anyone starts walking again, the group has another problem. Where exactly are we? That question could be more important than almost anything else. The group has to be counted, water and supplies have to be checked, the landscape has to be reassessed, and the route has to be reconstructed from whatever reliable landmarks remain. The storm didn't just make travel difficult, it may have erased some of the information that made travel possible. And that is why navigation was such a powerful survival skill. Long before modern GPS, people could carry detailed mental maps of the environments they traveled through. Routes were remembered, water sources were remembered, landmarks were remembered, seasonal patterns were remembered. And this knowledge could be taught through repeated travel and oral tradition. A child growing up in a desert environment could learn the landscape simply by accompanying older, more experienced travelers. Watch where they go, listen to what they say, learn the names of places, learn where water can be found. Learn which routes are used in different seasons. Over time, the landscape becomes familiar, and familiarity changes everything. Imagine two people standing in exactly the same desert. One has never traveled there before. The other has spent their entire life moving through it. A storm begins forming on the horizon. The first person sees an empty landscape. The second sees information, the same wind, the same sky, the same human body, but completely different knowledge. And knowledge changes behavior. The experienced traveler may decide to stop earlier, choose a different route, seek shelter, protect the water. Stay closer to the group. The difference may be only a few minutes, but sometimes a few minutes is enough. This is why the idea that ancient humans were simply tougher misses the real story. Physical endurance mattered, but endurance has limits. You can only go so long without water. You can only tolerate so much heat. You can only travel so far while exhausted, and no human body can simply ignore a violent storm. The real advantage was knowing how to reduce the number of situations where you had to test those limits. Don't travel during the worst heat if you can avoid it. Don't leave without enough water. Don't enter an exposed route when conditions are deteriorating. Don't abandon the group. Don't continue blindly when you no longer know where you are. These decisions don't look heroic, but they are exactly the kind of decisions that keep people alive. And desert societies weren't simply relying on individual courage. Animals could also become part of the system. Camels, for example, became enormously important to later desert societies because they could transport people and heavy loads across arid environments. But they weren't magical storm-proof animals. They were vulnerable too. The important advantage came from the entire traveling system: people, animals, supplies, routes, water, equipment, and knowledge working together. And sometimes the safest decision was even simpler. Don't travel. If conditions were dangerous, waiting could be better than moving. That may sound obvious, but it represents one of the most important principles of survival. You don't have to defeat every threat. Sometimes you survive by refusing to enter it. Of course, none of this guaranteed survival. People still became lost, animals still died, water still ran out, storms still arrived unexpectedly. Some journeys ended badly. Ancient knowledge shifted the odds. It did not control nature. And that distinction is important, because ancient desert travelers didn't conquer the desert. They learned how to negotiate with it. Every generation could inherit knowledge from the people who came before them. A safer route, a better place to stop, a reliable water source, a dangerous passage, a seasonal pattern, a lesson learned from someone who had already made the mistake. The landscape became a kind of library, but instead of storing its information in books, much of that information lived inside people. And losing an experienced traveler could mean losing knowledge that had taken years, sometimes generations, to accumulate. Today, we've moved much of that responsibility into technology. Weather forecasts can warn us about dangerous conditions. GPS can tell us where we are. Maps can show us routes we have never traveled. Vehicles can carry us through environments that once had to be crossed on foot. Buildings can separate us from wind, heat, and dust. If a dangerous storm approaches, most of us can simply go inside. Our ancestors couldn't rely on that separation. They had to pay attention, they had to remember, they had to prepare, and they had to depend on one another. That's what makes this story more interesting than the idea of ancient humans being superhuman. They weren't. Their bodies were human. Their lungs were human. Their need for water was human. Their fear was human. What changed was the knowledge around them. The desert forced people to turn observation into preparation, preparation into routine, routine into tradition, and tradition into a survival system. So how did ancient humans survive sandstorms? Not by standing in the middle of the storm and overpowering it. Not because they could somehow breathe through clouds of sand, and not because every storm was survivable. They survived by knowing the landscape before the storm arrived, by planning routes around water, by recognizing changing conditions, by using clothing and available shelter to reduce exposure, by protecting their supplies, by conserving energy, by staying connected to the group, and by passing environmental knowledge from one generation to the next. The storm was never something they defeated. It was something they learned to respect. Today, a weather alert might appear on your phone before you even look at the sky. Your GPS can tell you exactly where you are. A building can keep the wind outside. Technology has made the environment easier to ignore, but the human instinct underneath all of this hasn't disappeared. A sudden change in the sky catches your attention. A sudden loss of visibility makes you uneasy. And when you lose sight of someone you came with, your first instinct is often to find them. Because for most of human history, uncertainty wasn't just uncomfortable, it could be dangerous. And somewhere beneath all the technology around you, that ancient instinct is still asking the same question it always has. Where is the safest place to be right now? Because the real danger was never just being buried by the sand, it was losing the ability to know where you were.
If you enjoyed this video, subscribe to BackTimes, hit the bell icon, and share this video with someone who loves history.